Hello everybody, this is Yasmin from Yarkspiri fantasyart.com. In the drawing that I'm working on today, I'm mostly focusing on perspective because it is an indoor shot. So perspective does have to be fairly accurate, and it does take a while longer than if it's an outdoor scene. If it's an outdoor scene with a lot of foliage, you generally can fudge the perspective pretty well and still get away with a fairly decent drawing. When it is an indoor scene, however, you do have to be a little bit more technical in your approach. In order to do this, what I do is I do add perspective lines, really rough lines at first. It depends if I'm doing this traditionally or digitally. If I'm doing this traditionally, I have a lot of lines, mainly because I'm also using a ruler and roughing out the entire drawing before I actually start painting it. But because this is a digital medium, I'm just using really rough perspective guides. And from those rough perspective guides, I'm able to work out the general structure of the building. Now, the focus in this drawing is the character, not the background itself, because there is a character in the center point area. So the background can't be overly detailed. If it is overly detailed, it does take away from the character, and if the character is the focus, you want to avoid that. You want, obviously, the character to be the main focus of your drawing. So for this reason, I did make the background fairly simple. I didn't add too much detail. I did experiment later on in this video with adding some extra details, but like I said before, it just takes away from the character, and you don't want to do that. Not for this particular drawing anyway. As you've seen me do before, I do start out in grayscale, especially for a background. This enables me to really rough out really quickly some basic shadows for each of the objects and work out the general structure from there without having to worry about my color palette just yet. If this was an outdoor scene, I wouldn't have to necessarily do that. I do prefer doing that, however, but because this is an indoor scene, once again, it has to be a lot more technical. So I definitely do start with grayscale. For this drawing, I've decided that the main light source will be the light bulbs above the mirror. So for this reason, I'm darkening certain areas of the piece. Not at first. I do add the main shadows after I've actually added the basic shading to bring out certain details for the objects. But as you can see right now, I am trying to darken certain areas that would be hidden from the light source. Now, this light source does play a second key role in this drawing. It also provides an additional focal point to the mirror where the character will be looking into. And because it is the reflection that I want people to see as well, I have to draw people's attention to the mirror itself. And in order to do that, I do add the light bulbs above the character and above the mirror specifically. So whenever you're doing any drawing like this, it is important to take into account where you want your audience's attention to be drawn. If you want your audience's attention to be drawn to a small object, then you need to focus on that object. You need to draw people's attention to that object. Now, you don't want to make it overly obvious, like with giant arrows pointing towards the object that you want people to look at it. However, things like light source, keeping that in mind, can help you achieve the same effect, but more subtly. Now I just added a basic color to the overall canvas. This helps me set up the mood for the piece. I do want it to be have a certain mood to it. Although I started with a blue overall tone, I did add a tiny bit of red and some oranges. The reason why I did that is because it helps draw your attention towards, once again, that object in the center. Our eyes are automatically drawn to the color red because it does remind us of blood. And because we are hunter-gatherers, it's something to keep in mind. And now I did try adding this detail that I was telling you guys about before, but it was just taken away from it, so I ended up removing it a couple times. I did try a couple of different versions of it. I just didn't like how it looks, so I just took it out. Now to further enforce the perspective in this drawing, I did add a tiled floor. Tiled floors are really nice because they do help force the viewer to see that there's a perspective going on in the piece. Now you don't want to overdo it, however. You probably don't want to do that in every single drawing. There's other methods of achieving that same overall look of three-dimensionality. But it is one trick that actually works quite well, and I do use fairly often. But once I added the floor grid, I realized that the perspective on the bathtub was not correct. So I did have to go in and change that manually as well. Now, unlike the previous pieces, I'm actually just going to do a rough fill for this character first, just so that I can actually highlight the entire character. This just makes it easier for me to paint. I am not starting in grayscale, though, for this character. I decided to go straight to color. It's just a different style of painting techniques that I use for this one. I wanted to get a certain look, so in this case, it worked for this piece. Once again, I'm making sure that I have a very strong silhouette before I even go in and add any color whatsoever. And what I did here is I actually turned off that layer, but then selected the objects that were in it, and that allowed me to essentially paint within that on a separate layer. The same way that I worked with the legs, I'm actually working the clothes the same way. I fill in those areas with a basic color, and from those I'll add slowly, progressively darker and lighter tones in order to make the shapes read a bit better. Now, because I did mask everything out initially, before I started filling in these colors, the only problem with doing that is you do end up with a very hard edge. So that is something you have to get rid of. Otherwise, it just looks out of place in the background where it's not painted the same way. It can work depending on the style. However, for my style of drawing, that normally doesn't work, so I normally don't do it like that. Now, another way that I'm I'm drawing the viewer's attention is I have the character looking at the mirror. Once again, that's another method of drawing the viewer's attention to a specific area. Once again, this reinforces the fact that I'm trying to continuously draw the viewer towards that mirror, because that's where a lot of the information and what the piece is about is going to be. Now, as this piece is labeled, it is about clinical lycanthropy, so the focus is what the character in the center of the piece sees himself versus what we as outsiders perceive him as. So it is for this reason that it is his reflection in a mirror that is different. So I hope you guys liked this video. I found this one to be a very interesting piece to work on. So thank you for tuning in and stay tuned for my next video. Take care.